Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel where today we are going to be doing another recent reads. And I know that it's a little bit quick after I did my last one partially because I DNF'd a couple of these books and partially because I work at a school and school is now out for summer, so I actually have time to read. And also because I'm only going to be talking about 4 videos. We're going to try to make this video a little bit shorter, and also maybe I can remember a little bit more about the books. So, the very first book that I want to talk to you about is A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. So, if you don't know, this is an adult fantasy romance. It's a second book in a series. The first book in the series basically follows our main character, Afera, who is a human, and she shoots a wolf that she's pretty sure is a fairy and kills him. And then the fairies come and basically say, well, because you killed this shapeshifter fairy, then you have to come back with us to the fairy lands and just live out the rest of your life here. And it kind of follows her adventures there. So, spoiler alert, I did like A Court of Mist and Fury, and we'll get to that in a minute. Annoyingly, I liked A Court of Mist and Fury. But I really, really did not like A Court of Thorns and Roses this last time that I read it. Feyre is just kind of really, really dumb and impulsive and makes just terrible decisions. So I didn't really like following her. Our love interest was super bland. And like the world building was fine, but like not terribly interesting. And the plot was fine, but not terribly interesting either. So it just really was not fun to read. And then I got to A Court of Mist and Fury, and everything is so much better. Feyre is still dumb for like the first 50 pages, but in a way that when you look back on it, you're like, okay, we were setting up for the rest of the book. And she grows as a character and changes in ways that are really, really nice. And our love interest is significantly more interesting in this book and actually has some amount of depth of character. The other like secondary characters are actually more fleshed out and really just interesting. The world building is still not what I would call super interesting, but definitely better than the first book. And I found the plot to be intriguing. Like, what we set up for at the end of this book, and I was just like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna be reading the third book because I want to know what happens. Now I said that it was annoying that I like this book, and the main reason is because this book needs an editor in the worst way. It's like there's some people who like overwrite descriptions, and so when they get to describing a room or something, you can just skim it because it's way more than what you need. And the thing that Sarah J. Maas does is overwrites everything. And so I'll read 50 pages and be bored. And when like I pull back and like think about what happened in those 50 pages, A, it's interesting, but B, it's really not that much because there was just so much extra that just didn't need to be there. Like we could easily edit out like 100, 200 pages from this book and miss nothing. So like I'm annoyed because like I know that the next book is like almost 700 pages and I'm going to read it because I really do want to know what's going to happen next. I'm just annoyed that I'm going to have to get through 700 pages to figure out the ending of this story. So yeah, I liked this. I ended up giving it a 3.75 because I just could not give it more than 4 stars or more because like of how annoyed I was trying to read this just overwritten story. And so 3.75. I'm going to continue. I'm probably even going to go back and read ACOTAR and then reread this book. I don't know. Like, I'm pulled in. I'm not super, like, fangirl about it, but, like, I did enjoy it. Which is, like, a big surprise, and also I'm slightly annoyed. Yeah, it's how it goes sometimes. But then I picked up Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. And for those of you that don't know, yes, this is the book that the movie was based off of. But essentially, it was coined, I think, a techno thriller at the time that it was published. It was published in 1990. And essentially, it posits this world where we advance the technology of genomes and genome sequencing and being able to actually create like living beings with those genomes like really early on. And so in this book, basically there's a really, really wealthy person that decides that he's going to buy an island or rent an island. I'm not sure. I don't remember. And create a theme park around dinosaurs and actually like make real dinosaurs based off of their sequenced genomes. And so everybody can come and see real dinosaurs. And it goes bad like basically immediately. So on the upfront, I DNF'd this. However, I don't think it's the worst thing that's ever written. Basically, it was written in 1990. It feels very dated at times. Like there was actually one point where it talked about a Xerox copy, and I was like, oh, I haven't heard that since I was like little. And then I sat there and was like, I wonder what is the difference between a xerographical copy and a photocopy. And then I spent time on the internet like learning the differences. So that was exciting. But occasionally you did have some very dated references like that. The writing is a little bit clunky in this, and generally the characters are pretty bland. But the premise is interesting, and the writing of it is mostly intriguing. Like I kept going, even though I didn't think that this was amazing, until I got to page 103, something like that. And I asked myself, like, is this worth it? And what I realized when I was like kind of working through if I should continue on in this book or not is that this is a thriller. And for a thriller, you kind of have to suspend disbelief. You have to buy into the premise. And I didn't buy it. So like there was no part of me that was like able to truly get into this book and buy the premise. I just couldn't do it. So knowing that, I was like, well, it's not going to work as a thriller for me because you have to buy into a thriller for it to actually work as a thriller. But because of everything else, it really wasn't working for me in any other way either. So what didn't work as a sci-fi either. So at 100 pages, I was like, I'm just not enjoying it enough. And so I did go ahead and DNF it. Now, I don't think that this is the worst book ever. If you're into this idea of like, bringing dinosaurs back to life, this is not a bad book. You should go in with, correct expectations that like, it's not the most amazingly written book ever and it is dated. But I think if you go in knowing that, it can be a fun read. And then after that, I picked up Witches, The Transformative Power of Women Working Together by Sam George Allen. And this is a library impulse pick. I was in the nonfiction department, like little section, and I saw it and I was like, oh, I want to try that. And so I did, because that sounds amazing, right? We always hear about how the patriarchy and misogyny are keeping women down, but we don't really celebrate what like the triumphs of women coming together and like really supporting each other and what can happen when those groups are actually able to work together. So I was really pumped to read this. It did not pan out, unfortunately. So I read the introduction and the introduction was fine. It was like standard science fiction introduction. And then I got to the first chapter and it was talking about how teenagers really make the careers of these big bands. Basically, like, for example, the Beatles, that it was really teenage girls that drove like the popularity of the Beatles and all these other bands as well. And as I was reading the first chapter, it was fascinating to me that I looked at this and I was like, you're stating all these facts without any evidence. Like, you're not citing any sources, you're not pointing to any evidence for these things that you are asserting. That's really odd. And I even looked in the back of the book to see if there were any sources at the back, and there are none. So I was just like, that's weird. Also, you're not really doing a deep dive into any of this. You're just saying, like, teenage girls like drove the popularity of the Beatles, move on to the next band. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't feel okay, whatever. And so I moved into the second chapter, and that was much more about how, like, women who are in all girl bands or bands that contain only girls and non-binary folk, they feel much freer to be like creative and give more input and really like create music in the way that they want to. And I thought that's interesting. But again, well, there were a little bit more sources cited. There were interviews that she is quoting from, like, where she interviewed female members of like all girl groups, that kind of thing. But again, we weren't really looking at like big events. They were just saying, oh, we just feel better and we feel we make better music when it's just women. And I was like, but is it actually better music? Do you just feel like, I don't want to discount anybody's feelings or say that it's terrible, like it's not worthwhile for the members of the band to feel better, but also that's not what I was expecting from the book. And I was looking at this going, this is just not really what I expected, nor is it really what I wanted, especially when you take into account the fact that all of the like transitional material is really the author talking about her experiences with this stuff. So it feels like half memoir-ish. I was just like, I can't say that this is a bad book, but this is definitely not my kind of nonfiction and definitely not what I was looking for. So I ended up DNFing this book as well at page 50. I really had wished that this had turned out better, but I don't necessarily think it's a bad book, just not necessarily the book for me. And then lastly, the last book we're going to talk about that I finished is Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan M. Metzl. And this is an adult nonfiction, and it is a really interesting premise where the author basically goes into 3 states that are in like middle America and looks at one policy for each state, links that policy to poor health outcomes for white people, and then also traces that policy back to traditions of racism. And so they're making a very clear line between racism, this policy, and it eventually, like that racism killing Americans, white Americans even. And so this is really, really interesting. I listened to this on audio and I was fascinated by it. So basically this guy went to Missouri to look at their gun laws, or lack thereof, because there really aren't any gun regulations. Went to Tennessee because they have scrapped basically all healthcare insurance, like did not expand Medicaid, Medicare, any of that kind of stuff. And then went to Kansas because of their lack of education spending. And basically what this author does is in the chapters is to say, okay, we're going to look at this policy and we're going to look at the facts and link it directly to health outcomes. So for example, with the guns, there's just a higher rate of gun deaths, and especially the numbers that they were really looking at was like white male suicide and how that dramatically increased in Missouri. Or like healthcare, obviously, you know, there's a lot more deaths when you're not getting health care. And then education is also linked with poor health outcomes as well. And then from there, basically looking back to see why so many white Americans are supporting these policies that don't work well for them, and linking them directly to traditions in the past that are very much racist. So while the individuals themselves that are supporting these policies may not be overtly racist, they are still supporting traditions that are racist. and like they clearly haven't interrogated that kind of thing. And so I found this to be incredibly fascinating, and I think that the author did a really great job conveying his research and his thoughts and like putting it all together into a cohesive whole. I think he did a really good job not being super repetitive, which is a really common thing in nonfiction books. And I just generally found this to be a really fascinating book. And I think the only thing that I struggled with was the fact that because I was listening to it on audio, there were these interviews that were put in between chapters, and I struggled to follow the interviews because I just don't think it necessarily works as well over audio. I think I just needed to read it with my eyeballs. But it was okay because the interviews like added some depth but weren't like critical to the message that was being conveyed. So I think that it was good over audio, but I may have done even better if I had actually read this one with my eyeballs. But I thought it was really, really well done, and I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. So that's it. Those are all the books we're going to talk about in this particular recent reads. As a preview for next time, I have already finished my next book, and it's Steel's Edge by Alona Andrews. So you'll just have to wait until next time for the review of that. But that is all I have. So if you have any thoughts or feelings about any of the books I have mentioned in this video, please leave me a comment down below. But that's it. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to, and until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!